I didn't ask for an apology. I didn't wait for one either. The day my father slid a single piece of paper across the kitchen table and said, "We can't afford it," I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at my younger brother's new car parked in the driveway, the one they'd bought him 3 weeks earlier so he could get around campus comfortably. A car. For a boy who hadn't even declared a major yet. I picked up my acceptance letter, folded it in half, and walked to my room. I didn't slam the door. I want to make sure you understand that part. Because what happened over the next 10 years was never about anger. It was never about proving anything to them. It started that evening when I sat on the edge of my bed, looked at the acceptance letter from the University of Michigan's nursing program, and made a quiet decision. If they wouldn't build a floor beneath me, I would build my own. My name is Claire. I'm 34 years old. And this is the story of what happened when I stopped waiting for my family to see me clearly. My parents were not cruel people in the way that villains in movies are cruel. They didn't yell. They didn't call me names. They were something harder to argue against. They were quietly certain that my brother was the one worth investing in. My brother, Daniel, was charming and loud and filled every room he walked into with the kind of easy confidence that made adults lean toward him at dinner parties. He was going to study business. He was going to do something. I was the steady one, the responsible one, the one who had worked a part-time job since I was 16 and had never once asked them for money because I already understood without being told that it would be complicated. When I got into Michigan, I thought something might shift. I had a 3.9 GPA. I had letters of recommendation from 2 teachers who used words like exceptional and rare. I had a plan, nursing school, then a hospital residency, then a specialization in critical care. I had laid it all out in a conversation with my mother the week before I showed them the letter. She had nodded and said, "That sounds very practical, honey." I thought practical was a good thing. The day my father said they couldn't afford it, my mother was standing at the kitchen counter. She didn't turn around. She kept drying the same dish she'd been drying for 2 minutes, and I understood then that this wasn't a financial conversation. This was a decision that had already been made, in some quiet exchange between them, before I ever sat down. "Daniel's tuition is a lot," my father said. "And the car, we just can't stretch it further right now." I nodded. I didn't say, "You could have asked me before you bought the car." I didn't say, "I have been working and saving and asking for nothing for 3 years." I didn't say any of the things that were pressing hard against the inside of my chest. I said, "Okay." And I meant it as a closing, not an agreement. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I got 2 partial ones. It wasn't enough for Michigan. I enrolled at the local community college and began taking pre-nursing prerequisites while I worked 30 hours a week at a medical billing office downtown. My parents said very little about this. My mother once mentioned, in passing, that it was smart to start small. I didn't respond. Daniel, meanwhile, moved into a dorm room that my parents helped him decorate. My mother drove 4 hours to help him hang things on walls and set up a mini fridge. I got a card on my birthday that year with a $20 bill inside. I was 19. I transferred to a state nursing program after 2 years. I paid for it myself. Loans, scholarships, and the billing job I'd kept the entire time. I graduated with my RN at 23. Started working in the ICU at Riverside Medical Center, and began studying for the CCRN certification exam on my lunch breaks. My manager, a woman named Ruth, who had 30 years of ICU experience and a direct manner that I came to love, told me 6 months in that I had good instincts. "You don't panic," she said. "That's not something you can teach." I didn't tell my parents about any of this in real time. We had a relationship that existed in brief phone calls, usually initiated by my mother, usually on holidays. She would ask if I was doing okay. I would say yes. She would tell me what Daniel was up to. A new internship, a new apartment, a trip somewhere warm that my parents had partially funded. I would listen and say, "That's great," and mean none of it. Not out of bitterness, but out of a strange, settled distance that had grown between us and that I had stopped trying to close. My father called once, sometime in my 2nd year at Riverside, to ask if I could lend them money. A short-term thing, he said, just until a certain payment cleared. I told him I would think about it. I thought about the kitchen table. I thought about the dish my mother wouldn't stop drying. I called back and said I was sorry, but I didn't have the flexibility right now. He didn't call again for almost 8 months. This is the part I want you to sit with for a moment because I think it matters. I was not living in anger. I want to be clear about that. I had days that were hard, long shifts where I held a stranger's hand while they died and then walked out to my car in the parking garage and cried for 10 minutes before driving home. I had moments of loneliness that were sharp and specific. But I was building something. I could feel it, the way you feel a structure going up beneath you, slow and solid. I had friends I trusted. I had work that meant something. I had an apartment with good light and a kitchen. I had stocked myself and a savings account that grew every month in small, satisfying increments. I was not waiting to be rescued. That part of me had been folded up and put away the same night I folded that acceptance letter. In my 5th year at Riverside, I was accepted into a nurse practitioner program. I kept working while I studied. 2 years later, I had my NP license and a new position in the hospital's cardiac step-down unit with a salary that would have seemed impossible to the girl who'd sat at that kitchen table. I bought my own car, used, practical, exactly what I needed, and felt a satisfaction in writing that check that I have never been able to fully explain. I was 31 when my mother called to tell me that Daniel was getting married. I had met his girlfriend, Ashley, once at Christmas the previous year. She was pleasant. She laughed easily. She had a way of talking over people that I suspected she didn't notice herself doing. I had no strong feelings about her either way, but my mother's voice on the phone was different from its usual measured cheerfulness. There was something underneath it, a brightness that was almost effortful. "We'd love for you to be there," she said. "It would mean a lot to Daniel." I paused. There are pauses that are about hesitation, and pauses that are about deciding how honest to be. "I'll be there," I said. The wedding was in September, back in my hometown, at a venue I vaguely recognized as the renovated barn outside of town that everyone used for events now. My parents had helped pay for it naturally. It was a nice venue. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I drove up the Friday before and checked into a hotel 12 minutes from my parents' house, which I mentioned because my mother had assumed I would stay in my childhood bedroom and had said so with a warmth that made the assumption harder to push against. I pushed anyway. I told her I had early morning calls the following weekend and needed reliable quiet. It wasn't entirely untrue. The rehearsal dinner was that Friday evening. I arrived in a navy dress I'd bought specifically for the trip. Nothing remarkable, clean lines, comfortable, and sat at the end of a long table and watched my brother hold court from the center. He was 30 now, a little heavier, with the same easy grin. He worked in sales for a tech company. He was good at it, apparently. He waved at me from across the room and said loudly, "Claire made it," as though my presence were a pleasant surprise, which perhaps to him it was. My father hugged me. He smelled the same as always, a specific combination of cedar and something chemical I'd never identified. My mother touched my arm and said I looked wonderful. I said thank you. I was seated next to a woman named Patricia, Ashley's aunt, who asked me within 4 minutes what I did for work. When I told her I was a nurse practitioner specializing in cardiac care, she put her hand flat on the table and said, "My goodness, how long did that take?" And I said, "About 8 years, all told." And she shook her head slowly the way people do when they're doing math in their mind. My mother was watching from 2 seats down. I saw her expression shift, not dramatically, just a small recalibration, like something she had filed in a particular mental drawer for a long time had turned out to belong somewhere else. I had not told my parents specifically about the NP program or the new position. It had not felt like a conversation I needed to have. The wedding itself was the following afternoon. It was warm for September, the good kind of warm, and the barn was strung with lights that made everything look softer than it was. I found my seat, nodded at relatives I recognized, and settled into the particular patience required of family events. The ceremony was 20 minutes and genuinely sweet. Daniel cried a little when Ashley came down the aisle, which surprised me and made me feel warmly toward him in a way I hadn't expected. Whatever else was true about our family, he was my brother, and the sight of him crying at his own wedding made him human to me in a new way. The reception was where things changed. I was standing at the edge of the room near the bar holding a glass of club soda and talking with my cousin Renata when Ashley's father appeared at my elbow. His name was Martin. He had been seated at the head table during the ceremony and I'd seen him during the rehearsal dinner. Tall, silver-haired, the practiced ease of a man who had been running things for a long time. "You're Claire," he said. Not a question. "I am," I said. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize. "Ashley mentioned Daniel had a sister in medicine," he said, "but she didn't mention Riverside." I looked at him more carefully. "Do you know the hospital?" "I'm on the board," he said. There was a pause. Not an uncomfortable one, actually. More the pause of two people realizing they are standing on overlapping territory they hadn't mapped before. Martin, as it turned out, had been on Riverside's board of directors for 4 years. He knew Ruth, my old manager, well. He knew the chief nursing officer by first name. He was, in the world I had spent 10 years building, a figure of some significance, and he was staring at me with the expression of a man recalculating something. "You're in cardiac step-down now," he said. It wasn't a question either. "I am." "Dr. Yuyen's unit." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "She speaks very highly of a Claire in her unit," he said. "I should have put it together sooner. I didn't know what to do with this information, so I did what I always did in situations I hadn't anticipated. I stayed still and waited. "There's a position coming open," Martin said, and his voice had shifted into something more deliberate. "A nurse practitioner lead role. It's new. We're restructuring the step-down unit. More autonomy, administrative component, oversight of the junior NPs." He paused. "Dr. Christ, UN has been looking for the right person. She asked me about it just last week." I was quiet for a moment. "That's interesting," I said, which was genuinely the most neutral, honest thing I could find. He smiled. "I'll mention to her that we spoke," he said. "If that's all right." I said it was. He moved on to speak to someone else, and I stood there in the warm light of my brother's wedding reception and felt something I did not expect to feel. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but something quieter and more complicated than either of those. I looked across the room. My mother was watching. She had been watching for some time, I realized. She had seen Martin approach, had watched the whole conversation from a distance she couldn't close, hadn't heard a word of it. Her face was unreadable and entirely readable at once. She was doing that math again. My father appeared beside her and said something in her ear, and she shook her head slightly. Daniel, at that moment, was laughing at something on the other side of the room, his arm around Ashley's waist, completely unaware that any of this had happened. And I was glad for that, actually. It wasn't his story. He hadn't done anything to me, not really, not in any conscious way. He had simply been chosen, the way people are sometimes chosen, without understanding what the choosing costs someone else. I found my mother later, near the end of the evening when the dancing had started and the room was loud enough that a conversation could be semi-private. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, "I didn't know how far you'd gone." I considered several responses. I chose the true one. "You didn't ask," I said. Not harshly, just plainly. She looked at her hands. My mother was 61 years old and had spent most of her life managing the household and managing my father and managing the particular social architecture of a family that presented one face outward and kept other things internal. She was not a bad woman. I had arrived at that understanding slowly and kept it carefully because it was the only version of the truth I could live inside without it eating me. "We should have helped you," she said, "with school." "Yes," I said. "You should have." She looked up. She looked up. I think she expected me to offer something more, a softening, and it's okay. The absolution that daughters are supposed to provide when mothers finally admit to something 20 years late. I didn't offer it. Not because I wanted to wound her, but because it wasn't mine to give. What had happened, it happened. The 10 years were the 10 years. The thing I'd built was the thing I'd built, and it didn't require her retroactive approval to be real. "I'm proud of you," she said. "I want you to know that." I nodded. "Thank you," I said. And I meant it, not as forgiveness but as receipt. She had said a thing that was true and I had acknowledged it. That felt like as much as we were going to get to that evening in that room. I drove back to the hotel at 10:30. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes with the windows down, listening to the late summer sound of crickets somewhere beyond the asphalt. I thought about the acceptance letter I had folded in half at 19. I thought about Ruth telling me I had good instincts. I thought about Martin's expression when he put together who I was. I thought about my mother's hands. I did not feel like I had won something. I want to be clear about that too, because I think the story of being overlooked and then succeeding is often told as a revenge story. And it wasn't that. It was just a life. My life, built in the spaces where I had been told there was nothing. Dr. Ewan called me on a Tuesday morning, 9 days after the wedding. She asked if I'd be interested in discussing the lead NP role. I said yes. We met the following week. I was offered the position 3 weeks after that. I took it. I called my parents to tell them on a Sunday evening, the same way I told them anything now. Briefly, without seeking a particular reaction, offering the information as information. My father said, "That's wonderful, Claire." My mother was quiet for a moment and then said, "I always knew you were capable of something like this." I let that sit without examining it out loud. "I know," I said. "I know you did. Because here's the thing I have learned, the thing that the 10 years taught me in ways that no one could have accelerated and that I would not trade. Other people's belief in you is nice when you have it. It is genuinely warmly nice. But it is not load-bearing. You can build an entire structure without it. You can build something real and solid and yours. And when the people who withheld it finally come around, when they look at you across a room at a wedding and do that quiet math and come out with an answer different from the one they started with, it doesn't undo anything. It doesn't rewrite the kitchen table. It doesn't give back the nights you studied alone in a small apartment with pasta on the stove, because it was the cheapest thing you could make that week. But it is something. It is the particular something of being finally, actually seen. I accepted that something. I didn't make it more than it was. I put it in the right-sized drawer, next to the folded acceptance letter I had kept all these years, and I went back to work.